Mike is happy for me to record. So once again, welcome to our webinar today. I'm just going to go through a couple of announcements, and we would bring on our speaker for the day. So it is Discovering Agile Community. That's what we're called. You're probably thinking, what is Discovering Agile Community? We are a group of people, community coming together so that we can enlighten people about Agile, bring people together to share ideas, share knowledge and skills so that we can better grow Agile. The agenda for today is the welcome note, which is what I'm doing right now at noon. And we're going to have some announcement, networking, the breakout rooms will be open. And then about 12:30-ish, depending on how it goes, we're going to have our speaker for an hour. And then at 1:30 Eastern time, we are going to be closing. But we're flexible, we plan, but planning is what we do the most. So next month, we would have Thorath joining us all the way from Germany. And he's going to be talking about how to pivot in pandemic. So if you're experiencing features that separate you, if you want to experience features that separate you from competitors, or you have senior executives and company that want to talk about new vision and strategy, then you want to join this session next month. So our virtual networking is next month on the 6th of March. It's a Saturday. We have a 3-hour networking coming up. And also we have our mentoring program, which is an ongoing thing. If you're interested, at the end of today, we will be sharing information on how, if you want to be a mentor or if you want to be a mentee, and how you can join that. And the next thing that I'm going to be sharing is about our conference that is coming up in April. This is a free event. But registration is very important. You have to register. We have loads of speakers coming in to speak about topics that matter to them. And I am going to leave some time for networking, people to chat and see how that goes. And if you have any questions, please let me know while we'll wait for a couple of people to join. And Mike, I will give you the opportunity to test your slides for a second, and then we'll go back to introducing you.
Okay.
So network time, I am opening the breakout rooms. Please feel free to connect with people. And if you want to have a conversation here, we're more than happy to have a conversation. I think one thing that we miss a lot against the meetup, physical meetup, is the connection part of it. So we're trying to recreate that. This is the first time we're trying the networking virtually. So feedback is welcome. And if people feel that they don't want to do that and go straight to Mike, that's fine too. So we're welcome to feedback. One thing I forget to mention is that today, this month's webinar rather, we are doing it in recognition of the Agile Reflect Festival. And I believe you must have been on some of the websites, some of the webinars that has been happening in this month of February. If you haven't, please go to their website and attend some of those fantastic webinars that are happening across the world. It could be in the morning, Eastern time, or night. There are a lot of events going on. So take up the opportunity. You still have a couple of days. So I have a feedback that says straight to Mike. Okay, so thank you for that message. And because people are not even making use of the breakout rooms, I'm going to close it and then we will go straight to Mike. So let me introduce Mike. He's better introducing himself, but I met Mike a couple of years ago at a Agile Coach Camp. And I went to him and said, hey, Mike, I would love for you to speak on this platform, which I am hosting. And he was like, yeah, but he has to sync with when I'm in Toronto, I think he said. And I thought, oh, okay. So where are you then? And ever since we've not been able to do this. So I'm quite happy that this is happening in 2021, and he doesn't even have to leave his home. He can join us from anywhere he is. So welcome, Mike. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. So for those who are all curious about that, I live in the middle of the Rocky Mountains in Kelowna, BC. So that's where I'm calling you from today. Really quickly about me, I started my Agile journey about 20 years ago. There's at least one other person on this call who's been doing it as long as me. And learned a lot of things along the way. Of all the things I do as a coach, the messy people stuff, why people do what they do, how do we motivate people to do things differently, sent me off on a journey to get better at all of that sort of stuff. And it's taken me into the most fascinating journey into neuroscience, psychology, hypnosis, body language, and a whole bunch of other fields. And everything we're going to talk about today comes from those worlds. So a couple of disclaimers up here. I'm going to give you a whole bunch of different tips. Some of them will contradict each other. Consider the context for each, because they aren't all universally applicable. Some of them apply in specific contexts and not in others. So consider the context carefully. The second disclaimer is that the slides are text heavy, which is not my preferred way of teaching, but there is a lot of content here, and these slides will be made available to you later so that you can review them, and that's why they are that way. Thirdly, ask questions anytime. That's not a disclaimer. That's just a request for you. Don't hold them up. If you've got a question, let me know. So if we look at retrospectives in general, we go through a number of different processes in order to do the retrospective. And if you're familiar with the pattern, the standard pattern provided by Diana Larson and Esther Derby in the retrospectives book, you'll notice that this is a little bit different from theirs. I personally find this structure a little bit easier to wrap my head around. If you prefer their structure, that's fine. All the tips will also fit into their structure. But I'm trying to give you some context of where I would use different tips at different times. And so we start off at the beginning, we've got preparation and logistics. So this is happening days or weeks before we've done the retrospective. Then during the retrospective itself, we potentially have an opening. We may or we may not do something formal for it, but if we do, then we need to have some idea of what we want to do in that spot. Then we've got the core of the retro, which are the items in blue. We review things that have happened. So if the purpose of this retrospective is we are just doing a general, how do we get better, which is a common use of a retrospective for teams, then we'll review what happened in the last period of time since we met. So in the last 2 or 3 weeks, what's been going on that we want to reflect on. If this purpose of this retrospective is instead because of a specific event, we pushed something into productions and things fell apart and we want to reflect on that, then we would review what happened at that stage. But there's always some level of review, either over a period of time or over a specific event, because we're trying to collect our retrospective around that activity, around those items that we're reviewing. Then we diverge, we're brainstorming, we're coming up with all kinds of different and interesting ideas. And it's a very explicit step where there's no criticism, we're just coming up with all different ideas. Then we turn around and we converge, and we bring that number of ideas down to a smaller, more manageable level. And finally, we come up with actions. And those actions are tangible things that we will do at some point in the future, possibly before the next retrospective, possibly just at some fixed time, where we'll stop and reflect and see, did those actions actually make us better or worse? And then finally, we may or may not have a closing. It's up to you whether or not you do, and we'll talk about some tips for that. So just setting the context, these are the specific steps within a retro, and all of the tips will be pointed out at specific times. It doesn't mean that a tip couldn't be used somewhere else, but I've lumped it in the area where I feel it was most appropriate. So if we start off with preparation and logistics, we want to move to a different space. Have you ever had this experience where you walk into the kitchen only to discover that you've just forgotten why you walked into the kitchen? We've all had this experience, and it's called the doorway effect. It's a well-researched phenomenon, and it has to do with the way we store and retrieve memories. So as we move from one space into another, and it doesn't have to be through a doorway, although doorways are the most common ways that it happens, as we move into the new space, as I enter the kitchen, my brain thoughtfully packs away all of the things that were relevant to what I had been doing in the previous room and unpacks all of those things that are now relevant for my being in the kitchen. And this works all the time, constantly, as we're moving from one area to another. And most of the time, our brain gets it all right. And it does all of the things that give us the information we need at the time we need it. But sometimes, just as when I walk into the kitchen, it packs away the reason that I came in here. It packed away the wrong piece of information. And so now I'm in the kitchen, not knowing why I'm here. And we've all had this experience. So how is this relevant for what we're doing here? Well, if we were doing a stand-up, for example, we would want people to have an easy access to the things we were doing day to day. So for a stand-up, we would want to be in the same space that we do the work, because we want to make it easy to remember all of those things that we've been doing. But a retrospective is the opposite of that. In a retrospective, we want to deliberately pull ourselves away from the day-to-day so that we can think at a higher, more strategic level about how we're improving things. And so moving to a different space will help to do that. Now, if we're physically in the room, it's easy enough to move to a different room with a different whiteboard. It's a little trickier remote, but there's still things we can do. We can change backgrounds. We can change the tools we use. I remember a client I worked with a number of years ago who decided to change the background color on their login screen. They changed it from one shade of blue to what they felt was a more pleasing shade of blue. That's all they did. It was still blue, but they changed it from one shade of blue to a different shade of blue. And they found that the morning that they rolled that change out, the help desk was overwhelmed with people who couldn't remember their passwords anymore because they had just conceptually moved through a doorway into a different space. And now all of a sudden they couldn't remember the reason they came there, just like walking into the kitchen. So if we move to a different space for the retrospectives, it will be easier to get away from the day-to-day to be able to focus at a higher level. So move to a different space. Fear shuts down a part of our brain called the prefrontal cortex, which is where we do all of our higher level logical thinking. And when we are afraid, what our body does is it triggers the parasympathetic nervous system. Sorry, it triggers the sympathetic nervous system, which sets us into a state of fight or flight. And in that state, our body shuts down a bunch of non-essential services, one of which is the prefrontal cortex. And I could spend a long time going into all the different things that happen when you move into that fight or flight state. But for the purposes of this discussion, all we care about is fear. When we are afraid, the prefrontal cortex shuts down, which means that while we can still react to the situations around us, we're not thinking at our highest, best strategic level thinking. And of course, where do we need our highest, most best thinking? It's when we're trying to reflect again better. So if we are afraid, it's really going to cause a problem. We're not going to be able to do the things that we need to do during the retrospective. So what specific things could we care about for this? Well, for example, if we have your manager is in the same room as you for the retrospective, and you're now trying to talk about all the things that you might have done wrong in the last week so that we can try to get better at them. Are you likely to share those things with your manager in the room? Of course not, because you've got a little bit of fear. Now, for most people, it's not a tremendous amount of fear, but it's enough fear that the prefrontal cortex starts to become a little less effective. So this is why I will go out of my way to kick managers out of retrospectives. Managers are not invited by default to a retrospective. It's only if the team says, this is a specific retro where we feel it's valuable to have the manager, then we'll invite them in. Otherwise, they're not included. Another example where fear is an issue is that I've seen a lot of teams that will take notes during the retrospective and will publish them on some public site, on a wiki somewhere within the company. They'll publish all the notes. Here's all the things we talked about. Again, if I know that you're going to publish everything about what I said, how likely am I to say all of the things that are actually making me perhaps a little more vulnerable, but also allowing us to make bigger, more positive changes? And the answer is I won't be. So fear is a real killer for retrospectives. We want to do everything we can to make this a truly safe space. So that means no managers are coming to the meeting. We're making a point of not recording meeting minutes. Now, that doesn't mean that we never write anything down. Sometimes we'll write down the actions and we'll make them public. But we don't write down all of the conversations that happen, because those conversations may have been sensitive and may have caused a fear reaction if they knew they were going to be public. Moving on, allocate more time than you think you need. If you get partway through a retrospective and then you stop and you take a break, even if it's for lunch, and then you come back and you try to pick it up again, you just can't. There's a continuity of process, a continuity of thinking that cannot continue. That once we've interrupted it, our brains cannot get back to the point that we were at before. So we want to make sure that we always have enough time to get to the end of the process, to get to the action step. I'm less concerned about the closing, but we need to be able to get to the action step. If we don't, we just wasted everybody's time. We could have gone through and had brilliant conversations about all these different ideas and things we might want to do, but if we don't get to actions, it was a complete waste of everybody's time. So I always allocate more time than I think they'll need. I never book a retro for less than 2 hours. I see teams all the time that say, oh, we'll book half an hour for a retro or 45 minutes for a retro. Well, if you happen to be lucky enough to get to the action step within that time, then you're good. But if it turned out that you actually needed an hour or you needed an hour and a half, you just wasted the entire team's time by having that meeting at such a short period of time. So always, always allocate more time than you think you need. Bring things to fidget with. Now, this is more of an issue when we're physically in the room. If we're all remote, then everybody can be expected to bring their own fidget things. And more than likely, the people that like to fidget already have things in front of them. In fact, many of you probably have things to fidget with right now because you're in your environment where you've set things up to be successful. But it turns out that an awful lot of people think better. This is not just well, I'm distracted and I'm doing something. Many people, particularly those who are primarily kinesthetic, think better when their hands are busy. So allow people to keep their hands busy so that they can do the appropriate level of thinking. We want to get the best out of people during the retrospectives. And so we want to do all of those things that allow them to operate at their absolute best. One of my favorite things is Lego. I love to bring Lego out. And if I'm teaching a multi-day class, there'll be Lego on the table the whole time because I do a lot of other things with Lego. But if I don't have that around with me, because it is bulky to carry around, pipe cleaners will work just as well. Even a whole stack of multicolored sticky notes and a whole bunch of different multicolored pens, that's enough to give people something to work with, something to keep their hands busy so that they're thinking more effectively. There are numerous studies on these things that I'm talking about, specifically around doodling, around playing with things, taking notes by hand versus typing them in. There's tons and tons of research that shows that when our hands are actually busy, we are learning more effectively. The one about doodling was particularly interesting. There was one in particular that I'm thinking of that showed that we had increased memory retention if we were doodling during the talk. So if you're doodling now, go for it. Even if the doodle, the thing you were drawing, had nothing to do with the subject. You could be drawing pictures of cats right now and still be absorbing more of what I'm saying than if you weren't doing anything at all. And we have studies to back this up.
Hey, Mike, it's Tom. I have a question.
Yeah, of course.
So one of the hazards of remote work, I believe, is multitasking. Mm-hmm. And I think there's kind of a slippery slope potentially from this kind of fidgeting and alternative activity to people actually doing other stuff and being distracted
Yes.
by that. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that, the potential for people to kind of drift into that mode.
Yeah, that's a really good point. When you move your attention away from the topic at hand, you're not obviously learning. But if your attention is on the topic and your hands are busy, you're retaining more. So you're absolutely right that it's really easy for us to drift away and focus our attention on my phone, or on the IM that just came in, or the email that arrived, or the person who's walking down the street outside my window. It's very easy to focus our attention that way, and then we're not benefiting from it. But keeping my hands busy while my focus is on the main subject is incredibly effective. Did that help, Tom?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, the next one is encourage playfulness. And for this, a tiny little bit of theory. We have these things called ego states, which are really personalities. And a typical healthy person has about 150 different personalities that we're going through all the time. And although this may seem a little odd because we tend to only talk about personalities in cases like DID, where people have multiple distinct personalities that don't know about each other, but we all instinctively have those. And again, a healthy person has about 150 personalities, of which we switch through 10 to 15 on any given day that we're rotating through on a regular basis. The ego state that I am using as I speak to you now is very different from the ego state that I'm in when I'm down on the floor playing with my cat. We're in a very different state. We have access to different memories. We have different capabilities, different ways of doing things. If you really want to get bizarre, some ego states can have different eye colors, but we're not really going to go there today. There's different things that go on with different ego states. It turns out that our playful ego states are our most powerful learning states. So if we can get into a playful state somehow, either with toys or, as I can see from George, playing with your cat who's come to visit, if we can get into that playful state, we will learn more effectively than if we're in a more serious state. So things we can do. We can bring out paper clips. And I did not plan this ahead of time with George, but I'm using cat paper clips on the example here. I've pulled these out all the time. If I'm in a class and I'm handing out handouts, multiple page handouts, I will put the craziest paper clips on them because this gives people something fun. And I've had people in a class look at the paperclip and say, oh, dogs, I love dogs, or cats as it happens to be. So this switches people into a playful ego state. And when we're there, we are learning more effectively. And it could be anything. It could be toys or games, the Lego that I talked about earlier, the pipe cleaners, even multiple different colors of stickies. I never bring all yellow stickies. I will always bring an assortment of colors, trying to get people into that more playful ego state. One note I will make is that if you're going to go out and get the paper clips once we're back in the room, there's a wide selection you can get. There's cactuses and cats and dogs and all kinds of things, airplanes. I would advise you to not get the dog bone, because I made this mistake once, and once you clip the dog bone on a piece of paper, it no longer looks like something work appropriate. And I'm just going to leave it there. So next state, and this is also an ego state tip, is consider whether you are participating. If you were the Scrum Master or the facilitator of the meeting, consider whether you are participating or facilitating. And they are different ego states. When you are participating, you are not facilitating. And when you are facilitating, you are not participating. And I know there's a lot of people who think, well, of course I can do both. I can come in and jump in and inject my comments while still holding the space and facilitating. And the answer is you truly cannot do them at the same time, because they are different ego states. You can rapidly switch back and forth between them, but now you're not doing either one of them terribly well. So if you want to participate in the retrospective, ask somebody else to come in and facilitate it for you. It could be a different Scrum Master from a different team. It could be a different team member. It could be somebody from outside your team. But just if you want to be doing that participation, don't fool yourself into thinking that you can do both well, because nobody can. You can do one well, or you can do the other well. This is an interesting facilitation technique. The person who holds the pen tends to control the conversation. In a room, it would be an actual marker. So if we need, as part of the retro, to take notes, I would ask somebody else to write the notes because it belongs to the team. Now, if you are the Scrum Master, then you also belong to the team. And as a member of the team, it's not horrible if you're the one taking the notes, but me as an external coach, it is horrible if I take the notes because then the team doesn't own them. So we want to make sure that whoever is controlling that pen is part of the team because that person controls the conversation. It could be the same in a remote setting. Who's actually taking the notes? We're going to open up a shared document and somebody's going to write the notes. Make sure that it's a member of the team and not, particularly if you're an external facilitator, make sure it's not you. But even if you're an internal person, as a Scrum Master, try to let it be somebody other than you, because then the team will own that more. So that was facilitate. That was the logistics and getting ready. Now we get into the opening. I don't always open. In fact, I often don't have an explicit opening other than welcoming people in and seeing what they're going on. But the one key thing that I always do is that ahead of time, I try to calibrate the team. And by calibration, this is a term that I've learned from studying some therapy. I have studied hypnotherapy. And so we talk about calibrating the patient or calibrating the person we're working with. And this means know what their normal baseline is. So if I know what the team looks like on a normal day, then if they come into the retro and they look different, I know that something's up. Whereas if I've never met the team before, or if I've never paid attention to the team, I won't know if they're having a normal, typical day, or if something is really stressing them out. So we want to calibrate the team ahead of time, learn how to read them, so that if they show up in the retro in a state that is not conducive for what you had planned, you're able to switch quickly. I remember one case in particular that I had a team that I was working with, and they came in for a retro, and I'd planned out all these things. I don't know, I was doing a sailboat or something else, but I had all of these plans of how I was going to do it. And as soon as they walked in the room, I realized that there was something up. They were all just boiling over, ready to talk about something. So I just pushed aside everything that I had planned, and I said, talk to me, tell me what's going on. And they ranted for an hour, and we had the most fabulous retrospective because they were in a different space. Had I actually run them through the original exercise that I had planned, we would not have got the benefit that we did. But because I had calibrated the team ahead of time, learned how to read what was normal and what was not for them, I was able to adjust in time. So always calibrate your team and be prepared to drop whatever it was that you had planned and do something completely different. So consider if you even need an opening or an icebreaker. This is not team building. I've seen a lot of people who will use the beginning of a retrospective as a team building exercise. Well, if your team's been together for 6 months already, why are we doing team building again? If you feel you need team building, set aside explicit time for that. The retro is not that moment. Sorry, somebody had a question? Okay, so what I do use the opening for, if I need to, is to make sure that I get the team into the right headspace. So if they come in and everybody is just really, really tired, I might do something perky to wake them up. If the team comes in and they're all really angry, I might do something to try and diffuse that anger before we move into the rest of the retro. I am trying to get to a good positive space so that we can have the retrospective. And that is the only purpose in my mind for the opening. I see a lot of people who do an opening because they read in a book that they were supposed to do an opening. I would also call out that not everybody enjoys openings. Using them inappropriately can actually undo what you're trying to achieve. So if you force openings on teams that don't like doing silly openings, then it can turn everybody right off. I've seen that far too often. So then we get to the review stage. And as I mentioned before, two different purposes for the retro. In one case, we're just trying to generally get better, in which case we're reviewing, well, what's happened in the last period of time. And also, the actions that we had from last time, did we actually do those things? And if something bad had happened, we're reviewing what actually happened in that bad situation. So two different purposes for the review, but there always is a review step of some kind. In the review, here's a simple language pattern. This comes out of hypnotic language. Avoid who and why questions. Who and why can trigger the amygdala, which will send people into a fight or flight state. It can force them back into that fear place. Who caused that server outage? Why wasn't this reviewed? Who did that stupid thing? Asking those questions will set people back into a negative fear-based state, at which point we've just lost all the benefit of the retro because now we're not reacting. The prefrontal cortex is starting to shut down. We're just reacting and not thinking at a higher level. So instead, what should we ask? We should ask what, when, and how questions. When did this outage happen? How did we get to this point? What were the conditions that happened? Now, that doesn't say that doesn't mean that who might never be the right answer. We might say, who was the first person to notice that we had this problem? That doesn't seem so bad, but as a general rule, who and why can be very damaging. So be very careful when you use those in the context of things that have gone poorly. You know, who did this phenomenal thing is a great question, but who caused the server outage is not. So in the context of something negative, be very careful around what you say. If we want to talk about something in the retro that went poorly, again, we need to light up the neural network. This is, again, a term that comes out of therapy, where what we mean is that in order to fix something, in order to get us past it, we need to activate the parts of the brain that were active when that situation happened. So something bad went on. We pushed something into production and it blew up. Well, how were we feeling in that moment? We want to, where were you at that time? What did you notice? What were the things that went on? And then we can start to address and to fix the problems that are going on. If it's just some theoretical exercise, well, theoretically things might go wrong. We're not actually going to be solving the problems because now we're not looking at it from the real, what happened. It's not tangible anymore. I'll do this a lot with Lego exercises. So for example, if I'm trying to teach outside of the context of a retro, if I'm trying to teach, for example, technical debt, I will use Lego to walk somebody into a trap. If I had just theoretically talked about technical debt and why they'd want to do it, then everybody will give me theoretical answers and, well, no, we would never do that thing. But I can walk them into a trap in Lego and then say, you just did this thing. Let's reflect on why we did that thing. Whereas otherwise they would have said, oh, no, I would never do that thing. We need to light up the neural network, get them to the place where they're feeling that it's real and tangible. Now we can talk about solution. We get to the diverge step. This is where we're brainstorming. We're coming up with all kinds of different ideas. We'd like to get people moving. We have science here that backs up that brain plasticity and cognitive function are significantly improved by physical activity. And there is a great research study on that, just getting people moving. And this is a lot more. We used to just talk about if you can get people moving, then it gets oxygen to the brain. It's actually a lot more to it than just that. It's not just getting oxygen to the brain. There's all kinds of things that are going on that are benefiting us if we can get people moving. So I might do, in a physical room, I might do things like physically putting the sticky notes in a place where you can't get to it without getting halfway out of your chair. I might ask people to go and move things and put them on a whiteboard that's just far enough away that they have to get out of their chair. Have physical objects that need to be reordered in front of them. So there's all kinds of things we can do to get people moving. It's a little more challenging in a remote setting because if I move too much, I'm now off camera. But there's things we can do. We'll see what we can do. Now, there is a big caution here. Obviously, we all work with people for whom mobility is a challenge. And so we don't want to either embarrass those people or we don't want to cause them physical discomfort. So we always need to be aware of the mobility challenges of the people around us before we do anything like this. But if we can get people moving, there is a huge benefit to brain plasticity and cognitive function. We are thinking better. In divergent thinking, novelty is really beneficial. This first study here will actually come up twice in the slide deck because it indicates a whole bunch of interesting things about novelty. So novelty benefits creative performance when we're doing divergent thinking, when we're trying to come up with all kinds of ideas. What are all the possible different things we could do? Well, we could do this and we could do that, and we could do this other thing. And well, what about that? And what about this other thing? Coming up with all of those, novelty really helps. So this is why when we're doing our retrospective techniques, we don't want to be doing the same retro week after week after week. We might want to try a sailboat one day and a starfish the next, and try something different, maybe using sticky notes one time and a different tool another time. All different things. The more different approaches we can do, that novelty really helps us with divergent thinking. So it is worth calling out that retros use divergent, convergent, different thinking at different stages, and we'll talk about convergent and how that's different in a few slides. But as much novelty as we can do during divergent is the best thing we can do. Don't do the same old when we're trying to get divergent thinking. The real insights that we want, those aha moments when the light bulb goes off, requires that we first had a resting state in the brain. We have to have a moment of brain pause when our brain just relaxes. But our society today doesn't lend itself to brain pause. The moment we're finished doing one thing, we immediately reach for our phones and check, are there any messages? Or we reach for the laptop, or I get up and I go and I do something, because we've been ingrained by our current society to always be busy, always have something on the go. I'm sure you've noticed that the moment I stop talking, you might check your phones, you might do something. And so we never really get that moment of brain pause. So if we can set our retrospective up in such a way that people are forced to be still for a moment, then that will allow for the insights or those aha moments to pop up. Study again there. So I will suggest things like, you might want to ignore your phones for this one. Just turn your phone over for now. Do some silent writing. So we might ask people to write things out on sticky notes before they go and put them on the board, or write down your own idea before you share it with the group. So anything we can do to cause people to just stop and relax and rest for a moment, that will encourage those insights, which we really need during our retrospective. Next is we don't want criticizing during the diverge step, because although I don't link to any studies here, there is actually quite a bit of research on this, that the moment we start criticizing ideas, our brains start to narrow the focus. And so it's really, really hard to stay on divergent thinking if we're starting to criticize. So we want to make sure that we're not doing that. There are different hemispheres of the brain going on. Criticism comes off the left, which is where all the logic and time sense is happening, and creativity is all on the right side. So as we are focused on coming up with all kinds of ideas, the right side of our brain is lit up and we're doing fabulous things. And as soon as we switch over to the left, it's now hard to come up with those new ideas. So write down everything that comes to mind, no criticism until we're finished this step. Now we're going to get a little weird for you. If I haven't been weird enough already, I'm about to go off the deep end. If we talk about what is a brain, we look at all of these different things. It's got large numbers of neurons and ganglia, and it does all kinds of processing, and we generate a bunch of neurotransmitters like oxytocin and serotonin and dopamine and all these things. So we've got all of these different chemicals going on, and your brain does all of these different things. And it turns out that we don't have just one brain, we have three. And the science on this, the neuroscience, is actually quite fascinating, because the people studying, well, the three, before I get too far, the three are the head, which you could argue is two because of the right and left hemisphere, but it is one, the head brain, you've got a heart brain, and you've got a gut brain. And the gut brain is about the size of a cat's brain, and it has similar kinds of processing that goes on. And until fairly recently, the people studying the gut brain were confident that there were two brains, the gut and the head. And the people studying the heart brain were confident that there were two, the heart and the head. And the heart and the gut people only recently discovered that the other existed. And so now we realize that there are, in fact, three of them, at least three, because now, of course, everybody's hedging. Well, we were so confident that there was only one, and then we were really confident that there were only two. And now we're fairly confident that there's three, but we don't know how many more there are. So we have three different ones. And this book that's behind me right now, Using Multiple Brains to Do Cool Stuff, is quite a fascinating read. It goes into a lot of the science and does some interesting stuff behind that. So how is this relevant for what we're doing? Diverging is mostly head brain. So the head brain is self-talk, imagery. If you hear people saying things like, I think this, or I've considered that, or this makes no sense, or this looks like that, then the person is focused primarily on head brain. And that's great for diverging thinking. If you hear other things like I feel, or I'm following my heart, or this is more important, they're no longer diverging. They're now starting to do some converging. And we'll get to the other two brains in a moment. But the point is that we want to be listening for these kinds of words. So if we need to get somebody back in that space, if they're saying, well, this is more important than that, they're now converging again. And we might say things like, well, how are you thinking? What are you thinking about this? Have you considered this other thing? We want to get them back into that headspace of using the head brain, because diverging is almost primarily head brain, not entirely. All the brains come into play at different times, but diverging is largely a head brain activity. So moving along, this is the other half of novelty. That same study that I linked to before actually says that it inhibits creative performance when convergent thinking is required. So if we've got all kinds of novelty and we're doing different things all the time and we're trying to converge, it actually makes it more difficult to converge. So this is why I want something new and novel all the time when I'm brainstorming. I want to be using the same technique over and over again when I'm converging. So I always do it the same way. I always have people following the same pattern because we want familiarity. We want a lack of novelty when we're trying to converge on the ideas. So it's the same study. If you want to go and read up on it, it's interesting stuff. So avoid your novelty when you're clustering, converging, and voting. Converging is mostly heart brain. So the heart brain is all about values and emotion. Interesting, the oxytocin, which is the neurotransmitter that is sometimes called the love drug, it's all about bonding and how we connect with other people. 50% of the oxytocin in our body gets generated from the heart brain. So people talk about values and emotions. They say, I feel this, or I'm following my heart, or this is more important, I'm connected to this idea. So we might ask questions like, how do you feel about that? What's important here? Getting us focused on that. So if people are still up in their heads, because everybody will lend themselves more towards one or the other. For example, I tend to be head focused. I tend to live in my head. I'm very focused that way. Whereas other people tend to be much more emotional or much more action oriented. And so we all have a preference of where we follow. And so asking people these questions can help switch them into other brains. So converging is mostly heart brain. We get to the action step. Put the actions on your board. If we talk about actions and then we never think about them until it comes to the next retro, the odds of us actually completing them is almost zero. So put them on your board, whether you're Scrum or Kanban, they need to get up on the board. So we're talking about them every day. We said we were going to collaborate more effectively. Well, how have we been doing that? We said that we were going to be more proactive about talking to other teams to get the information we needed. Well, have we done that? Let's talk about that. So make it visible. In the case of Scrum, it goes into the sprint backlog before any of the work from the PO, because this is stuff that we must get done before the next retro. So we put it in there first, and then we fill up the work with other things that the PO cares about. We talk about them every day, just like we would for other work. And in a Kanban system, they get into ready at some time that is a reasonable time frame. We can't say we'll decide on an action now and work on it in 6 months. No, we decided on an action now. We're going to start on it at least in the next couple of days. You want to pick a small number of actions. If we pick 50 actions to do, we're not going to do any of them because this is how we work. If we've got too many things to focus on, we won't do any of them. But if there's only one thing to focus on, we'll get it done. So I'm really happy with the team if they've picked one action. I'm okay with 2. I'll let them go as far as 3. I won't do more than that. Unless they're really small. We don't want more than that. One action is more than good enough because the purpose of the retro is to get better. And if we do one action to get better, we're getting better. Maybe not as fast as we'd like, but we're going to get better. Whereas if we said we're going to try these 50 or 100 things, and I do see this with teams all the time, everything they talk about, they say we're going to create actions off all of them, and then they do none of them. So pick a small number of actions and then get them done. We want to pick an experiment. So we want to lower the level of commitment. Commitment is a hard thing. It requires mental energy to actually commit to something and doing it. If we say we've decided that we want to do pair programming, for example, let's say that was the thing that came up out of the retrospective. We want to try pair programming. If we now say, this is the way from now on, we're going to pair program on everything forever, that's a really big commitment. Because we haven't really tried it yet. We don't know how effective it's going to be. We don't know if we're going to like it or if we're not. And so it's a really big commitment to say this is the new way of doing things. And yet I see teams do this all the time. The retro item is the new way. So I propose that you do an experiment. You say, well, what if we did it for a week? What if we pair programmed on a whole bunch of stuff for a week, and at the end of the week, we stopped and we reflected and we look back? That's a much lower level of commitment. And because it's a lower level of commitment, it's much easier for people to say, yes, I'm going to do that. So always run it as an experiment. Pick a time box, preferably a short time box. Now, sometimes we have to make the time box longer, because if I want to say, well, the next time a specific kind of defect comes in, we want to address it in this way, but they only show up once a month, well, then it needs to be a longer period of time. But we want to find some experiment that's relatively short that we can reflect on when it's done. We're trying to get that commitment level down, because committing is hard. Now, I told you earlier that we were getting rid of who and why. Now we're going to reintroduce why. Because at this point, when we're coming down to actions, why we want to ensure that they get done. And why questions have an interesting side effect that we haven't talked about yet. I talked about how why can trigger the amygdala. If we're asking about a negative thing, why did you do this thing? Why did the server go down? That can be very negative. But why also has the ability to cement things, to make them more real. So if you say you're going to go start an exercise program, and I say, why are you going to start an exercise program? All of a sudden now, even if you didn't already have a rationalization for it, your brain will make up one. It may not be valid, but your brain will make up some rationalization to justify the thing that you just said, because I ask you for a justification. So asking a why question like that can actually reinforce and make it stronger, make it more likely that people will do that thing. There's a whole set of techniques in psychology around motivation that are just asking the why questions. Why did you choose to do it that way? And then people are more likely to actually do it that way. So if somebody says we want to try pair programming, well, why do you want to try pair programming? Why do you think that would make us better? That's an excellent use of why, because it makes it more likely that they'll actually try it and see what's going on. We need to question limitations on our actions, because we often think, well, there was this thing over here that happened that I really hated. Management pulled us off onto something different, or this thing blew up, but there's nothing I could do about it. There's no point in even writing it down as an action, because I couldn't possibly do it. So many of our limitations are self-imposed, and we don't believe that we can do it just because we didn't know the way. But that doesn't mean that it's not actually possible. There was a quick diversion. There was a time that you couldn't repartition a hard drive without blowing away all the data on it. And then these guys, probably about 30 years ago, Partition Magic, came out with a tool that would allow you to do it. And shortly after it was released, I met one of the co-founders of the company at a conference, and over drinks, we talked about how he'd come about with this idea of repartitioning drives. And he said to me, it was interesting that all of our competitors knew it wasn't possible to do this, so they didn't try. But us, we were too stupid. We didn't know it wasn't possible, so we just did it. And there's a really important lesson in there. They didn't know that it wasn't possible, so they just did it. And they created a brand new market. So we should always be questioning our limitations, because even though we think something is out of our control, it often isn't. Actions are almost entirely gut-brain. Just talking about some of the neurotransmitters again, serotonin, which is the action drug, 95% of the serotonin in our system comes from the gut brain. And so serotonin is all about driving us towards action. So if you hear people say, I'm doing this, my gut reaction, the next step is this, they're in gut brain. They're doing a lot of gut brain type things. If they're in the action step and they're still talking about, well, I think about this, or maybe that's important, they're in the wrong state. So what's the next step? What are you going to do? What concrete actions must you take? What is the first smallest step you could take towards your goal? Get them into an action focus. Let me get to the closing. And again, I don't always do a closing. Sometimes once we've got the action, I just say, thanks for your time. We're moving on. We're done. But sometimes I feel it is important to close. And that's to ensure that the team is in a positive state. Sometimes the topics we talk about during a retro can be pretty deep and powerful. Sometimes they can be a little depressing or demoralizing. And we want to make sure that we don't leave the team in a bad state when they're leaving the space and going back. So we might want to do something to get them back to a more positive state. And it could just be, changing the subject and getting everybody to laugh or doing something interesting. I'm going to give you an approach here, a technique from clean language that I really like. It's called the power switch. And this is just a really simple language pattern. Clean language is in itself is a whole fascinating topic that I would encourage you to take a look at, but we'd need a whole lunchtime session just for that. But the power switch is, and when something, what would you like to have happen? So for example, let's say somebody had just said to me, I got up on the wrong side of the bed and I tripped over the cat and I banged my knee on the refrigerator and then I missed the bus and it is the most horrible day ever. I can't imagine. And I say, and when you got out of the wrong side of the bed and you tripped over the cat and you banged your knee on the refrigerator and you missed the bus, what would you like to have had happen? And although it sounds like a really simple, trivial question, this uses some pretty deep-seated things in psychology to get people back into a positive state, even if their initial reaction is, well, that's stupid. I wanted none of those things to happen. They're still already partway back towards a more positive state. And so I might ask this a couple of times. And so when the server blew up in that way, what would you like to have had happen? And often, once I get past the initial, well, I would like it not to have blown up, what would you have liked to have had happen? Well, I would have liked earlier alerts. I would have liked earlier warning that there was going to be a problem. Okay, well, what's something we can do about that? So helping them get back to a positive state, because we don't want to leave anybody in a negative. Now, I don't find that this is necessary all that often in a retro, because typically by the time we've got through actions, the team is in a positive state anyway, but sometimes they're not. So just be aware of that. So just as before, we reintroduced why, now we're going to reintroduce who. So this is accountability. So this is a completely different situation. I'm not saying who did this stupid thing. I'm now saying who will ensure this thing gets done, or when will we check it back in, or what are the things? So who can be a powerful thing to, again, drive accountability. I'm not saying that whoever signs up is the person that has to do it, but somebody's going to follow up to ensure it gets done. And so who can be a powerful tool for accountability in that sense because of the way it hooks our brain. This slide could be a whole day session. So I'm just going to leave you with the chart. This is Googleable. It's up on Wikipedia. But cognitive biases are ways that our brain works to come up with answers quickly. Our brains are incredibly powerful, far more powerful than any of the computers we have today. But even our brains have limits. They can't recalculate everything all the time from first principles. It has to take shortcuts. It has to make decisions about what's going on. If I'm running into somebody, let's say I've met Kemi for the first time and I say, hi, who are you? Well, she's not going to think. She's not going to say, well, let's see, I think my parents named me this, or maybe, in the morning when I woke up, I saw my name written somewhere. She's not going to think about that. She's just going to blurt out the answer because she knows what her name is. And she knows what her name is because her brain has a shortcut for that. It has a bias. And so all of these biases are designed to ensure that we have quick ways to get to decisions. Because if we had to calculate everything from first principles every time, we would never accomplish anything. Most of the time, these cognitive biases work for our benefit. They get us to a better place, but sometimes they don't. And so it's interesting to note, it's interesting to be aware of some of these cognitive biases, like how we deal with too much information, for example, or what pieces of information should we remember and what pieces should we discard. There are hundreds of cognitive biases, and this chart is up on Wikipedia along with links to a description of every one of them. And it's worthwhile to know some of them, to recognize when people in your team are coming to conclusions that are incorrect because they've gone down the path of a cognitive bias. And that's where we need to start asking questions and probing and getting them back to first principles. And that is, again, a much larger topic, but I want to make you aware of it. So it's something that you might think to Google. It is a fascinating topic. So this is where we get to the questions part. The slides, which way do I have to go? The slides that I've got here are shared there. It only has the name of another event because I also gave this at that other event.
I have a question.
Yes.
How often you should do the retrospective? I mean, how long do we have to make time passes before having a retrospective? Because normally when we have a long period, then we forgot things, and normally we just remember on probably the bad things or some only good things. So what could be the time span that is most benefit for the retrospective?
It's really up to the team. The key is 2 weeks is a really common time. So for a regular recurring retro, 2 weeks is a very typical and common time, but that might not be right for your team. You need to adjust. The thing to keep in mind is that the longer you wait between retros, the slower you're improving. Because the retro is that point at which you stop and reflect and consciously make an effort to improve. So we could do them quicker. We could do them every week, which would mean we'd be improving even faster, but that also takes a lot of time away from the team. So if we're doing 2 hours every week versus 2 hours every other week, then we have to balance that. How much time are we willing to allocate versus how fast do we want to improve? It's a balancing act. But as I say, 2 weeks is pretty common.
Thanks.
Mike, it's Andy. Two things
Andy.
to support your first idea. The Zeigarnik effect. It's when waiters could remember the order while it's running. And if you ask them at the end of their shift what they recall, they'd say nothing. Context-dependent memory. They put divers on land or in the underwater, and then how they were giving the information, and they say how you recall the words afterwards. So if they got the words on land, they remember on land. If they got underwater, they remember underwater.
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
For the action items, yes, you put the list of action items. I tend to make the sticky notions of adding a name to it too. It's not just to make it public, make a sort of a commitment, but you stick the commitment to them. So you make it visible. If you want us to stick more, send them follow-up emails, to all team to remind. You could take a picture and a picture of the action items.
Right. Perfect.
That's it.
I have a question, Mike. We live in the virtual world right now where some of the things you've mentioned are kind of like hard to do. Like you would have some people not wanting to put on their camera video because of where they are. How can you make things much more better, given that you have to take into considerations their situation, right? But you still have to do a retro that is productive.
Right. We can do a retro even if everybody's got their video off. Obviously, I would prefer that it was on. But there are some people who reasonably can't put it on for a whole variety of reasons. So we can do it with all the videos off. It's just, it becomes a little more challenging because we have less information. I pick up a lot in particular from body language. And so if I can't see people, I'm not picking up on those cues that tell me when they're following, when they're not, when they're feeling comfortable with the topic and when they're not. But we do the best we can. You can still pick up things from audible cues. If they are both video off and muted, you've got nothing. But if they've at least got the audio on, you've got something, you've got some cues that are coming on. There's things we can do.
Yeah. So George is mentioning do it. He's saying something in the chat box, and I was just wondering, Mike, if you don't mind for him to elaborate on that.
Sure. I haven't been following what was in the chat window.
Can I tackle the video off while you're trying to?
Yeah. Go ahead.
We tackled that on our mentoring program this week, actually. There's a study of 2018 where they say you could actually pick up emotions much better in the audio than on the video. They put them in dark room and people have to discuss hard situations and see what happens. And with the same people, they study through Zoom, and then say, here's, you're gonna have to talk about this hard situation, and with video off, and they wanted to see if they could pick up on the emotions. People actually do pick up on the emotions much better with audio only. Well, that's based that you have good audio. Where we had issues is because the session was about reading the room, is where you know, like in crucial conversation, they say you have to read about signs of violence or silence. Silence is the hardest, you know, like when someone withdraw from the conversation or goes silent. And when you don't have that video cue, that's the hardest reading that you could have. But besides everything else, you can read emotions, you can read through audio only. And we ran the exercise of letting people here listen to this conversation and see what you could pick up. And they actually pick up more than when they were visual also.
Okay, so while Andy was going through that excellent description, I scrolled through and I saw that George actually has multiple excellent comments. So I'm not sure which one you wanted me to respond to.
That's right. He's been kind of like running a commentary after you. I'm like, the one I wanted Judd to comment on is that around, you can also have retrospectives with different constituencies.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. A team retro, I was focused mostly on team retros here, but I've done retros across entire IT departments. I've done retros across, you know, a safe art with 200 people. So you can do different levels with different groupings of people. And yes, you'll get absolutely different results. But the principles are largely the same.
Interesting. Thank you so much for that, Mike. Does anyone else have questions for Mike?
I've got one. Earlier, you were talking about silent writing on sticky notes. And in the virtual world, I find that silent writing on for silent typing on virtual stickies doesn't seem to accomplish the same things. And I was wondering if you had any comments on that.
I've noticed a similar thing. I've not seen any research that indicates anything one way or the other, but I've noticed the same thing.
Yeah, I just, I'm wondering what sort of virtual activity can fill in for that. I know that some people, I've gone to clients where they were completely allergic to using paper and pen. They said everything had to be digital, and that was their culture. I'm not sure it was the culture of everybody there, but it was certainly the culture of the people in charge. And so I've been looking for ways to get the same sort of participation, get people in the same mindset. And I figured you probably know a lot more about that stuff than I do.
Well, I have found that the choice of tool for that makes a huge difference. I've noticed that people are far more interactive with, for example, a Miro board than they are with doing something on a shared PowerPoint. But we've tried that as well. Multiple people collaborating on a PowerPoint, or using what's the Google Jamboard. So I find that there's a certain level of interaction with people there, whereas with a Miro board, I find that people are a lot more interactive, and I'm not quite sure what the difference is. I suspect it's because it feels more like a real tangible board than some of the other tools do. But again, I've not seen any research. It's all anecdotal at this point.
Because you have motion happening at the same time. You could see mouse cursors happening, but you actually see Post-it moving around. So it's like, oh, okay, it's animated rather than in a dead setting where you go and you put data and not data, but a line of text, and someone puts another line of text. Here you see the mouse moving. This idea will move on the left, on the right. So you have to be more acute to the spatial cue that's happening in the Miro board.
Well, I've used Google Presentation before. It seems to scale better than Miro or Mural, especially for ad hoc events. Where then people don't need any sign in or anything. It could, and you can use it just as a whiteboard with stickies to a large degree also. It's got some space constraints compared to these other tools, but still,
yeah, it's worth trying.
It still seems like a higher barrier from brain to words.
Yes. Yes, that's been my observation as well. But again, I've not seen any research that backs up one way or the other.
Mike, someone has said in the chat box that this is a fantastic session. I am new to Scrum. I am a new Scrum Master. This information is too much. Please advise where to start.
Absolutely. And this is designed really for people who have been doing retros for a while. If you are new at this, just don't worry about the specific tips. Try to get the essence of it. Remember, the key things are that you must get to the action step. If you don't get actions out of it, you wasted everybody's time. That is the single most important thing. So make sure you've allocated enough time, make sure that you get people actually thinking through things, having a good conversation, and then making a decision. And if you do that, then you've got something positive coming out of your retro. Everything else is just refinement, getting better and better and better.
All right, I'll just check if there are any other questions. Okay, someone just said I'm new to Scrum and I want to make a career. Okay, all right. Do we have videos for beginners? I'll let you answer that, Mike.
No, not really beginners. Most of my videos tend to be more advanced topics, but
okay.
I would recommend people start with Esther and Diana's book. And I think if you squint a little bit, you'll see that the format that they suggest is really about the same as the one that Mike suggests. It's, it's maybe not 100% aligned, and the names are different, but, you're still going through the same sort of thing. The data gathering is a divergent, and looking at it for patterns in that data is part of the divergent stuff.
Yes.
And then you want to converge down to concrete actions.
Yeah.
I agree. That is an excellent book.
One last question before we leave. How do you get feedback from the team about the retro? Survey or talking?
I just like to talk to people and find out, was it useful or was it not? If they don't do the actions, likely it was a waste of time. If they do the actions and they decide that they actually got better as a result of it, then it was a good use of time.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mike. I guess we have come to the end of the questions. So I would just quickly share my end of slides. So thank you, everyone. Most importantly, thanks to our speaker, Mike. It's been fantastic having you on, and this is always interesting when you speak to Mike. He's passionate about what he does, and he does it very well. So thank you for joining us. For those who want to join the community, we've got a Slack channel. You just simply need to take your camera out and take the QR of our Slack channel. And we also have a link page, a LinkedIn page. Please join. And the conference that is coming up in April, don't forget to register for it. It'll be nice to have you there. So thank you so much, everyone. It's been great having you all join us this afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you are. Hope to see you next month. Thank you.